The convoy slowed without warning on the edge of a village most maps had chosen to forget. No signpost, no marker, just dust, heat, and silence hanging heavy in the Sahel air. And then one small movement changed everything. A raised hand, a silent command. The soldiers behind it froze. Ahead, an old man stood alone, bent over a shovel, carving a shallow trench into unforgiving ground. His back curved with age and exhaustion. His shirt was soaked through with sweat, and yet he kept digging. Not because the trench could stop armed men with trucks and guns, but because doing nothing felt worse than dying on his feet. This was not a battlefield. There were no cameras, no press, no speeches, just an old man preparing for a threat he knew was coming and a leader who chose not to look away. Ibrahim Traoré stepped out of his vehicle alone. His security detail moved instinctively to follow, but he waved them back. He walked slowly toward the man, boots crunching against dry earth, and without a word he picked up a second shovel leaning against the wall and began digging beside him. For several minutes, neither spoke. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of grief, fear, and defiance. The old man glanced up, recognition flickering across his face, followed by disbelief. He tried to speak, but Traoré gently shook his head and kept digging. For 20 minutes, the president of Burkina Faso worked shoulder to shoulder with a man whose name he did not know, in a village no one had protected, against a darkness everyone else had ignored. Slowly, doors began to open. A young woman stepped forward with a baby tied to her back. A teenage boy dragged a pickaxe nearly too heavy for him to lift. Then another man. Then another. What began as a solitary act of desperation turned into a quiet line of resistance. Not organized, not armed, but united. And here is the question every American watching should sit with for a moment. When leadership truly matters, does it appear in carefully crafted statements? Or in moments like this when no one is watching and there is nothing to gain? Because what happened next would test not only the courage of this village, but the future of an entire nation. The old man finally broke the silence without lifting his eyes from the trench. His voice was rough, worn down by dust and grief. 3 nights earlier, armed men had arrived in trucks, 20, maybe 30 of them. They sealed off the roads, moved with discipline, and went straight to the homes of village leaders. His 2 sons were taken first, not accused, not questioned. Taken. The message was simple and deliberate. Join us or die. Leaflets were left behind. Warnings written in blunt language. The government has abandoned you. No one is coming. For men like Musa, that message was designed to finish the job fear had already started. It told him that resistance was pointless and obedience was survival. That digging a trench was foolish, that hope was a lie. And yet, he dug anyway. Not because he believed he could win, but because surrender felt like a slower death. Traoré stopped digging when he heard this. He turned fully toward the old man and asked a question that carried more weight than any speech. Where are your sons now? The answer was simple and devastating. I don't know. They could be dead. They could be forced to fight. Not knowing is worse than anything else. Around them, the villagers had stopped working. Fear was written on their faces, but so was something else. Expectation. They had heard promises before. Officials had come and gone. Aid had been announced and delayed. When the trucks came at night, there was no one but them. One of the men stepped forward and said what everyone was thinking. With respect, Mr. President, we've heard words before. When the guns arrive, words don't stop them. Traoré did not argue. He agreed. Words are cheap. Promises from far away mean nothing when death is standing in your doorway. Then he asked a question that changed the direction of the conversation. Are you ready to fight? The question landed hard. A young woman with a baby on her back spoke up. Fight with what? We have farming tools, they have weapons, trucks, explosives. The imbalance was obvious, and that was precisely the point Traoré addressed. You don't start by fighting them head-on. You start by refusing to be isolated. You build communication, you learn how they move, you warn each other. You survive long enough to stop being easy targets. Within minutes, soldiers were unloading crates from the convoy, not weapons. Radios powered by solar panels, medical kits, building materials, shovels, sandbags. The villagers looked confused. "Fortifications won't win a war," one man said. "No," Traoré replied, "but they will keep you alive long enough to change it." He listened carefully as Musa described the militants, the vehicles, the weapons, the languages spoken, the way roadblocks were set before attacks. The pattern was familiar. This group had struck multiple villages using the same method: mobile, aggressive, dependent on fear to recruit and control. Intelligence officers confirmed it quietly. The supply lines ran across borders, night routes, gaps no one was watching. Then Traoré made a decision that would define everything that followed. He ordered a forward operating base established nearby. Training, not conscription. Defense, not propaganda. Direct communication so that when one village was threatened, others would know immediately. No speeches, no cameras, just action. That night, Traoré slept on the floor of Musa's compound despite objections from his security team. He wanted no distance between himself and the people he was asking to stand their ground. The message was not for the media, it was for the villagers who had been told they were alone. By morning, the base was operational: engineers, medics, trainers. And with it came intelligence that sharpened the moment into a blade. The same group that had taken Musa's sons was planning another raid, another village, another night, another warning meant to spread fear. This time, the village would not be waiting in the dark. Here is the uncomfortable truth every seasoned American viewer understands. When a government chooses to stand its ground instead of retreat, violence rarely decreases at first. It escalates. And Traoré knew that what he was about to do would either break the cycle of terror or provoke retaliation that could engulf the region. Because once you tell people they are no longer alone, you inherit the responsibility to prove it. The intelligence was precise. The timing was clear. 3 hours after midnight, just as before, the militants would approach quietly, headlights off, confident in a pattern that had never failed them. Isolated villages, no warning, no resistance. Fear had always done the work for them. This time, fear was no longer alone. As darkness settled, elite units moved into position using terrain only local villagers truly understood. Dry riverbeds, tree lines, footpaths invisible to outsiders. Civilians from the target village were evacuated hours earlier, leaving behind homes that looked occupied but were empty of life. Radios crackled softly in the command unit. Every movement was deliberate, every second mattered. When the trucks finally appeared, they came exactly as expected. 3 vehicles, armed men fanning out with practiced efficiency. Their confidence was visible in the way they moved, unhurried, routine, certain no one was watching. They advanced toward the homes of community leaders, just as they had done in village after village before. Then the order was given. Light flooded the settlement from 3 directions at once. Spotlights erased the cover of darkness. Loudspeakers cut through the confusion, broadcasting commands in multiple languages. "Drop your weapons, lie down, you have one chance." The militants froze. Their advantage was gone in an instant. The commanders tried to shout orders to regain control, but they were identified immediately. Precision fire neutralized leadership in seconds. No chaos, no indiscriminate force, just control. The engagement lasted less than 8 minutes. When the gunfire stopped, 12 militants lay dead, those who had chosen to fight. 37 others had surrendered, their weapons abandoned in the dirt. And then came the moment that would echo far beyond that night. 6 hostages were recovered alive. Among them were 2 young men who matched the description Musa had given. His sons. They were exhausted, shaken, barely able to stand. Their wrists bore the marks of restraint. When one of them looked up and saw who was there, his voice barely carried above a whisper. "You came." The reply was simple. "I promised your father I would try." Medics moved quickly, guiding the freed hostages to evacuation vehicles. As they were driven away, the silence that followed was not relief. It was realization. Something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, the militants had failed publicly, not just tactically, but psychologically. The captured fighters told a familiar story, Some were barely adults. Others were hardened men fueled by fear, drugs, or lies. They spoke of commanders who promised protection, purpose, and power, of villages described as grateful, of a government portrayed as weak and absent. None of it had matched reality. Standing there, surrounded by disciplined forces and organized resistance, the illusion collapsed. One young fighter, trembling, admitted what many were thinking. They told us no one would come. They told us the people were abandoned. Now, I don't know what I was fighting for. He was offered a choice: face justice or help dismantle the network that had pulled him into violence. It was not mercy disguised as weakness. It was strategy rooted in understanding. Insurgencies survive on inevitability. Break that belief, and their power erodes. Over the following days, something unexpected happened. Messages began arriving through the newly established communication networks. Other villages were reaching out, not to beg, not to plead, to ask how they could prepare, how they could defend themselves, how they could stop being targets. Within 2 weeks, dozens of communities had requested training and support. Within a month, that number doubled. Ambushes failed because villages had warning systems. Raids were repelled because communities were no longer isolated. Recruitment dried up because young men saw that joining militants no longer meant power. It meant defeat. And at the center of it all was the image that no press release could capture. An old man who had once dug trenches alone, now standing in a compound reinforced by collective effort. A village that once waited for death, now planning for survival. But here's the question that should trouble anyone who has studied history. When hope spreads this quickly, it attracts attention. Not all of it friendly. Power vacuums invite interference. Strong examples invite enemies. What had begun as an act of solidarity had become a regional shift in momentum. And shifts like this rarely go unanswered, because when fear stops working, those who depend on it always escalate. The immediate aftermath of the operation felt almost unreal to the villages that had lived for years under constant threat. Roads once avoided after sunset were used again. Children returned to schoolyards that had stood empty out of fear. Families slept without expecting engines in the night. But beneath that fragile calm lay a deeper transformation, one that reached far beyond a single rescue or a single village. For the civilians, the most important change was not military. It was psychological. Fear had long been the militants' strongest weapon. It isolated communities, turned neighbors into silent witnesses, and convinced parents that survival depended on obedience. Once that fear was broken, even partially, the balance shifted. Villagers began to share information. Elders coordinated with surrounding communities. Women, often the first to sense danger, became early warning voices rather than silent victims. For the first time in years, people planned for the future instead of preparing for loss. But this transformation carried a cost. Not every attack could be stopped. Some villages were hit before training arrived. Some families paid the ultimate price for choosing resistance over submission. Traoré never hid that reality. Stability, he warned local leaders, would not come without sacrifice. Any strategy that promised safety without risk was a lie. The difference now was that sacrifice was no longer meaningless. It was part of a broader effort to regain control, not a quiet surrender to inevitability. Politically, the consequences were even more complex. By empowering communities to defend themselves, the government was redefining its relationship with rural populations. These villages were no longer passive recipients of distant authority. They became partners in security. That partnership strengthened trust, but it also raised expectations. Once people believe they are no longer abandoned, they demand consistency. They demand follow-through. And they demand accountability when help does not arrive fast enough. Inside the government, the strategy sparked debate. Some officials worried that decentralizing defense could weaken centralized control. Others feared that arming or training civilians, even defensively, might create future instability. History offered plenty of warnings. Militias formed in desperation have, in other regions, turned into power centers of their own. Traoré was acutely aware of this risk. That was why training emphasized coordination, communication, and restraint rather than brute force. These were not militias meant to replace the state. They were communities meant to survive until the state arrived. For Burkina Faso's political future, the stakes were enormous. Success would mean reclaiming territory not through occupation, but through legitimacy. Failure would mean proving the militants right, that resistance only brought greater suffering. Every village that joined the network became both a symbol of hope and a test of the strategy's limits. Internationally, the shift did not go unnoticed. Analysts observed that the conflict's dynamics were changing. Attacks became less predictable. Militants faced resistance in places they once treated as guaranteed targets. But observers also warned that success could provoke escalation. Groups that lose easy victories often respond with more brutality, more spectacular violence designed to restore fear and attention. And this is where the story becomes deeply relevant to an American audience. Regions like the Sahel do not exist in isolation. Instability spills outward through migration, through transnational crime, through extremist networks that do not respect borders. A Burkina Faso that stabilizes itself strengthens regional security. A Burkina Faso that fractures under pressure creates new openings for chaos. The question was no longer whether Traoré's approach inspired people. It clearly did. The question was whether inspiration could be sustained under prolonged pressure, whether communities could remain united when the costs mounted, and whether a government led by decisive action could transition from emergency leadership to long-term stability. History is unforgiving to leaders who ignite hope but fail to protect it. It is equally unforgiving to those who never act at all. Traoré had chosen action. Now the consequences, civilian, political, and regional, were unfolding in real time. And looming over all of it was the question no one could yet answer. Would this strategy anchor Burkina Faso against the storm ahead? Or would it draw the country into a deeper confrontation that tested its limits? Because the moment civilians stand up to terror, the conflict is no longer distant. It becomes personal, and personal conflicts rarely end quietly. From Washington to Brussels, what unfolded in that forgotten corner of Burkina Faso did not go unnoticed. Security analysts, diplomats, and military planners began asking the same question. Was this a local anomaly driven by a charismatic leader, or the early signal of a model that could reshape counterinsurgency in the Sahel? For American observers, the implications were immediate and uncomfortable. The Sahel has long been understood as a pressure zone, where weak governance, extremist networks, and transnational crime intersect. When states fail there, the consequences do not remain local. They move outward through migration routes, arms trafficking corridors, and extremist pipelines that eventually touch Europe and, indirectly, U.S. national security interests. Stability in Burkina Faso is not charity, it is prevention. Yet Traoré's approach challenges assumptions many Western policymakers have relied on for decades. Instead of prioritizing distant centralized control or foreign-led interventions, his strategy places ordinary civilians at the center of defense. That raises difficult questions for the United States. Community-based security can reduce recruitment and restore trust, but it also risks fragmentation if oversight fails. History has shown that when local defense structures outgrow accountability, they can become problems of their own. American analysts also recognize another risk. This model is deeply personal. It draws legitimacy not from institutions alone, but from the perceived integrity and presence of one leader. That can be powerful in crisis. It can also be fragile. If leadership falters, if decisions harden into inflexibility, or if external pressure isolates the country diplomatically, the same unity that fuels resistance can quickly fracture. There is also the geopolitical layer. As Western influence in parts of Africa has weakened, alternative partnerships have expanded. The United States must decide whether to engage pragmatically with leaders who defy traditional expectations, or retreat and allow others to shape the region's future. Ignoring Burkina Faso does not freeze events. It simply removes American influence from them. For older Americans who lived through the Cold War, Vietnam, and the long arc of counterterrorism, this story carries echoes. The lesson is familiar. Security is not built by force alone, nor is it sustained by ideals disconnected from local reality. It is built when governments convince their people that survival does not require surrender. The question for the United States is not whether Ibrahim Traoré inspires loyalty at home. That much is clear. The question is whether this moment becomes a foundation for lasting stability, or another chapter in a long history of hope ignited too quickly and abandoned too soon. And that question matters far beyond Burkina Faso. As the dust settled and the immediate danger receded, it became tempting, for outsiders especially, to turn this story into a simple narrative of triumph. A president picks up a shovel. A village stands up. Militants are defeated. Hope returns. But history warns us against stories that end too neatly. The real test of leadership does not come in moments of sudden courage. It comes in what follows, when attention fades, when pressure builds, and when the costs of resistance begin to accumulate. Burkina Faso now stands at a crossroads. The strategy ignited by Ibrahim Traoré has shown that fear is not invincible, that communities can organize, and that government presence, real presence, can disrupt even the most brutal campaigns of terror. But momentum is not the same as permanence. Networks must be maintained, discipline must hold, and the line between community defense and fragmentation must never be crossed. There is also a deeper risk, one that many Americans understand instinctively. When stability rests too heavily on one man's resolve, what happens if that man is removed, constrained, or forced to compromise? History is filled with movements that burned brightly around strong figures, only to fracture when those figures disappeared. Hope that is not anchored in institutions eventually becomes vulnerable. And yet, to focus only on risk would miss the deeper meaning of what happened in that nameless village, now called hope. This story is not ultimately about trenches or tactics. It is about dignity, about an old man who refused to surrender even when surrender seemed rational, about a leader who chose inconvenience over indifference, about the quiet power of being seen. For an American audience, especially those who have lived long enough to see promises broken and ideals tested, this story asks something more demanding than applause. It asks reflection. What kind of leadership do we recognize as legitimate? What kind of courage actually changes outcomes? And how often do we mistake speeches for presence, strategy for solidarity? If Burkina Faso succeeds, it will not be because militants were eliminated alone. It will be because communities believed they were worth defending, and were proven right. If it fails, it will not be because hope was naive. It will be because hope was not protected long enough to take root. So, as you think about this story, do not ask whether Ibrahim Traoré is a hero or a threat. Those labels are easy. Ask instead whether leadership, anywhere in the world, still has the courage to stand beside ordinary people when there is nothing to gain and everything to risk. And if you believe, as many still do, that justice matters, that dignity is not negotiable, and that faith without action is hollow, then this story is not just about Africa. It is about all of us. May wisdom guide those who lead, may strength protect those who stand their ground, and may God watch over the people who choose hope when fear offers an easier path.